it's an honor to be here. I greatly appreciate it. You know, Mexico isn't the only country, but around the world, people are very concerned about crime. It's particularly the poor, particularly the most vulnerable people. And it's not just the direct costs of people being victims of crime. You have other problems that occur. What happens to businesses that want to go and start in areas? Well, if you have high crime rates, they're not going to want to move there. So you affect people in terms of their jobs. And the question is, what can you do to protect people? Police are extremely important. My research indicates police are probably the single most important factor for stopping crime. But the question becomes, what do you do when the police aren't there? The police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And so that raises the question, what should victims do, or would-be victims do, when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And simply telling people to behave passively is not very good advice. You know, criminals are like anybody else. If you make it riskier, you make it more difficult for them to, quote, do their job, committing crime in this case, they're going to do less of it. And just like you can have higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates or longer prison sentences or even the death penalty that can deter criminals from committing crimes, the fact that would-be victims might be able to go and defend themselves can also prevent crime from occurring. I want to go through and just give you some ideas of how, I'm not sure if you can see this too well, how homicide rates vary across countries and look at maybe how gun ownership and crime vary across countries. This is the homicide rates for all countries. You can see I have two red lines here. This is for the United States, and this is for Mexico. The average is here, and the median is over here. So half the countries have a higher homicide rate, and half of them have a lower one. This data is from the UN. You have to understand, though, that the UN, when it gets this data, it just reports what it's given. It doesn't go and check to make sure that the data that it's given is correct. So in fact, it's even worse at the top end than it looks here, because a lot of the countries with the worst homicide rates have two problems. One is some of them don't even report the numbers, and others fudge or lie about the numbers. So for example, Venezuela, their homicide rate is likely maybe 50% or more higher than the official homicide rate. And that's not unusual that you're going to have those types of problems. Many other countries, more totalitarian countries or authoritarian countries like China or other countries, will hide what the actual crime data is in their countries. And also there's some other problems with this. One is homicides. People often think that homicides and murders are the same, and they're not. The big difference between homicides and murders is whether or not you include justifiable homicides. So homicides are murders where you intentionally go and kill somebody, and justifiable homicides. It's not really obvious to me why you want to mix in cases where, let's say, a woman kills somebody who's trying to rape her and count that as the same as a criminal going and killing a victim in terms of a robbery. Those are like two different animals, and to go and mix them together, I think, is misleading. In the case of the United States, we have a very high rate of justifiable homicides, and if you were to just put murders in rather than homicides, the United States would fall a fair amount by about 20% lower rate than it is shown there. But most countries in the world don't report detailed data. They'll just report total homicides. Here's some data on firearm homicides. Mexico is up here. The United States is here. They look relatively worse than they did before. Well, the main reason why they look worse isn't because they really are worse relative to other countries. It's because a lot of countries just don't report firearm homicide data. So, I mean, if the worst countries don't report it, you can make the other countries look a lot worse in terms of being in the top 10 or whatever, just because the data is missing in those cases. And here it is for developed countries. Mexico, Brazil, other countries are developed countries, obviously. This is for the Organization of Economic Coordination and Cooperation and Development, kind of the club of developed countries. And you can see here, Brazil has the highest homicide rate, Mexico second, Russia third, Chile, and then the United States. So they're relatively high compared to them. But, you know, one thing that both Mexico and the United States share, and that is we both have a relatively bad drug gang problem. In the United States, what you find is that over half the murders in the United States take place in just 2% of the counties. And if you were ever to look at what's called a murder map, where they go and show the murders in any given year, where they occur inside a county or a city, you're going to find most of those murders in those counties within 10-block radiuses, just 10 blocks. So they're very heavily concentrated, the murders in the United States, in very tiny areas, and that's often drug gang related. Most people don't appreciate, obviously in Mexico, a huge percentage of murders are drug gang related, and the same thing is true with the United States. Now, one thing that's often done is to go and show a graph that shows homicides rates on one axis and gun ownership on the other axis. And usually Mexico is left out of these types of discussions, even though they're looking at developed countries. But you can see the normal claim is that there's a positive relationship. More guns mean less crime. Well, what happens if we were just asked the question, what would the homicide rates be if we just took the United States out and asked what type of relationship do we get there? In fact, if you do that, you find a slight negative relationship. Now, a lot of this, I could go into detail. People can fudge data lots of times. So Switzerland here and Israel is supposedly down here have supposedly very low gun ownership rates. But one of the issues that you have is like in Israel, the government technically owns the guns. You may have a gun in possession for 50 years. You apply for it, they give it to you, but you don't own it, the government owns it. It's the question of gun possession or gun ownership. And if you were to fix that, you'd have many countries that would have much higher gun ownership rates than the United States have. Switzerland and Israel would be way out there. But the reason why you see the United States making such a big difference is that it's supposedly way out here by itself in terms of gun ownership, and just by itself it's pulling up that line. Just showing how sensitive it is there. Now you could also go and leave the United States in, but include countries like Brazil, Mexico, Russia, which have relatively low gun ownership rates and low homicide rates. And again, you'll get a slight negative relationship when you look across countries, even with the United States in. But they're usually left out, even though Mexico is part of the developed countries in the world. You look at all the countries in the world, and you look at gun ownership, even with the problems with measuring gun ownership that I was mentioning before, and again, you find a negative relationship. Of course, you have countries like Honduras and El Salvador and Jamaica and Venezuela that have extremely high rates of, and this is, if you look at it for firearms, you can see again, more guns seem to be related to fewer homicides. You get this negative relationship that exists there. Now, there's a problem in looking cross-sectionally across places in one point in time. So let me give you a simple example. Often, people will make a comparison between like the United States and a country like the UK, Britain. And they'll say, look, the UK has very strict gun control laws, has relatively few guns, and a low homicide rate. So it must be the fact that they have a low homicide rate because they have few guns compared to the United States. My response, and I'll show you a graph of this in a minute, is that they had an even lower homicide rate before they had the gun control laws. That the gun control laws, when they get passed, you saw an increase in homicides that were occurring. And so I would argue that they have a low homicide rate despite the strict gun control laws rather than because of it. One question, just to think about. Can you name one place in the world that's banned either all guns or all handguns and seen murder rates go down? Because I can't find it. Every single place that's banned guns has seen murder rates go up. You can't even find one place where it's remained flat. So here's for Chicago. And this is Chicago. Chicago and Washington, D.C. in the United States tried handgun bans. This is Chicago's murder rate relative to the other cities in the United States. It was falling prior to the ban in February 1977. It went up afterwards and stayed high. You can see Chicago. Chicago's murder rate was falling relative to other cities up until November 1982, and after the handgun ban, it went up. Now, we can look around the world. I could show you for lots of countries, but I'm just going to, given the time that we have here, I'm just going to show you for some island nations, because that's kind of the ideal experiment, because the concern would be for something like Chicago or Washington, D.C., that, well, criminals can go and get guns from other states nearby and bring them in. So unless you ban guns every place, it's not going to work. That doesn't really explain why murder rates would go up. It may explain why it didn't go down as much as they promised that it was going to. But what about island nations that don't have a neighbor to go and blame, that have well-defined, easily defendable borders that are there? And what you find, for example, with Ireland, which banned guns in 1972, you immediately saw a big increase in murder rates and it's continued high. Now, there are lots of things that are going on, drug gang problems like in Mexico and the United States, but even when you take those out, you still have a high murder rate after the ban. Or how about Jamaica? Prior, in the 1960s and early 1970s, Jamaica's murder rate was almost the same as the United States. As soon as they had the ban in 1975, you began to see this increase. Now, there's political violence, but a lot of this is drug gang violence. And I would argue, you know, you're just as successful, or likely to be successful, to stop drug gangs from getting guns as you have been in stopping them from getting drugs. This, you know, you could go and ban all guns in Mexico and all drugs, but how long is it going to take for the drug gangs to start bringing in drugs back into Mexico? A couple hours, maybe? And how long is it going to be before they bring in the guns to protect that valuable property? It's not like the gangs can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? They have to set up their own militaries, essentially, in order to try to protect that property that they have. You can see Britain. They banned handguns in January 1997. In the next 8 years, there was a 50% increase in homicides. It fell after that back down to where it was before, but the reason why it fell is that they had an 18% increase in the number of police officers right at that time. Here's Venezuela. This isn't an island nation, but you can see they had a gun ban beginning in 2012. They've since changed the rules very recently. But you can see it was increasing, and then it started increasing at a faster rate as soon as they had the ban go into effect. Here's Mexico. You know, prior to 1972, you guys used to have fairly liberal gun laws. After 1972, obviously, you have one gun store in the country. The only guns that you can, and it's in Mexico City, the only guns that you can legally own are essentially .22 caliber guns, which are like the smallest caliber guns just about that you can buy. Homicide rates were falling right up until the ban went into effect, or the regulations went into effect, and you can see it actually went up for about the next 20 years afterwards. Police, as I say, are important. But the thing is, police themselves know that they almost always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. I have just some data here for police times, response times in the United States. Dallas, 8 minutes, 39 seconds. These are for the top cases where people's lives are in danger. Houston, 5 minutes. Fort Worth, almost 9 minutes. Austin, 8 minutes. New York City, 7 minutes. Miami, 14 minutes. San Diego, extremely fast, 6 minutes. In parts of the United States, though, if you go to rural areas, you don't even have 24-hour policing. It could take 45 minutes or an hour for police to arrive. But even if police arrive in 8 minutes, that's a lifetime if you're having to confront a criminal by yourself. Police One is the largest organization of police in the United States. They have about 450,000 members. 380,000 of them are active full-time law enforcement. Just to give you an idea, there's 650,000 active police. Here's just one of the questions their organization asked. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how important do you think legally armed citizens are to reducing crime rates overall? You have about 77% of police officers in the United States saying letting law-abiding citizens have guns is either extremely important or very important in reducing crime. Here's another question. Considering the particulars of recent tragedies, these are mass public shootings like Newtown and the Aurora Batman movie theater shooting, what impact do you think legally armed citizens could have had? We have 17 million Americans that have concealed carry permits in the United States. 80% of police officers said that it would reduce casualties. Another 6% said it could reduce it altogether. You may not know this, but with all the mass public shootings that we have in the United States, 98% of the mass public shootings take place where guns are banned. They keep on seeking out places where people can't defend themselves. These killers may be crazy, but they're not stupid. They want to kill as many people as possible. So where do you go? You go to a place where people can't defend themselves. You read their diaries, you read their other statements, and they constantly talk about trying to find places where no one has a gun because then they can kill people before somebody can go and stop them. 98% of the time. You're in Texas, you can carry your permitted concealed handgun almost any place. There's just a couple percent of the place you're not able to carry. If these were random, 98% of the mass public shootings would be taking place in areas where people are able to have guns. Instead, they virtually all are occurring in those tiny areas where people aren't allowed to go and defend themselves. So who benefits the most from having guns? It's the most vulnerable people. There are basically two groups of people. It's poor people who live in high crime areas, and it's people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. Criminals like to pick victims that are relatively weak. If you have a drug dealer with lots of guns who has lots of money, you think a criminal is going to go after and rob him? No, they go after if they see a woman walking across a parking lot late at night and she looks relatively weak and vulnerable, that's the person they're going to pick. These guys are like anybody else. If they can pick an easier target, they're going to do it. And just like anybody else, if you can make it costly, if you can make it risky for them to commit the crime, they're going to be less likely to go and commit the crime. Thank you very much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.